I've been wondering, what is parody or satire? Is it love and affection for the source material, or is it a sign of exhaustion and irritation at common tropes? Is it both? And if so, how do you manage to juggle the combination in such a way that you end up with something new? So many creators seem to struggle to toe this line, but perhaps the greatest proof that it can not just be done, but done well, is Discworld. 32 years of work producing 41 award-winning books, numerous short stories, graphic novels, stage, radio and film adaptations, a cast of the most beloved characters in fiction, and many, many sharp, critical indictments of almost every aspect of modern society. Discworld is a fantasy series that managed the incredible feat of breaking into the international mainstream culture, and it's remarkable that it all came from the head of just one man. There are many ways to experience Sir Terry Pratchett's first entry to the Discworld universe, and in all probability, it's for the best that I went about it in a really unorthodox way. The sad truth is that this literary beast, an ongoing series that has over many years grown to become something of Herculean proportions, started out as something fairly simple, trivially light and lacking in many key areas. As a teenager, I first discovered the Discworld in the form of a graphic novel. It was an excellent adaptation which brings an extraordinary level of light and colour to the vivid world that Pratchett had conceived. As a comic strip, the adventures of Rincewind and Twoflower, well, they're episodic in nature anyway, so the pair moving from one adventure to the next, so the format of the story flowed naturally in the graphical format. My library had just the adaptation of The Colour of Magic, so for me, Rincewind's story ended here on a cliffhanger. But the graphic novel made me aware of the Discworld, and I then went on to hunt down some other books. Equal Rights, Mort, Going Postal, all great on their own. None of them quite hooked me and made me hunt down the rest of the series. But then many years later came the television adaptation starring David Jason and Sean Astin, which offers an entirely different take on these two characters, turning them into an elderly inoffensive bumbler and a keen but outwardly obnoxious American tourist. Enjoying that version, I then returned to the source material, finding an abridged audiobook read by Sir Tony Robinson, who invests such wit and life into the characters, his voice feels like the definitive voice of the series. But when, some months later still, having gone through every single one of the Discworld franchise in the abridged form, I finally decided to go back and just check the original book. And I found that there was yet more to discover. As good as Tony Robinson's narration is, the source material is often heavily abridged. Each iteration of this story brought to it something the others didn't, but, well, I'd personally, because it's the last version I experienced, struggle to call the original book the definitive take, as despite containing the most material, it's also very clear from reading it just how far the author improved as a writer as he went on and developed the Discworld further. As I said, the story feels extremely episodic, but the flow between segments is almost non-existent. The opening portion of the book is told in flashback by Rincewind to two onlookers watching the city of Ankh-Morpork burn, whilst trying to fathom how it happened. This opening segment is perhaps the strongest part of the novel, as it has a natural flow from the arrival of Twoflower, the chaos his very presence brings, and the all too inevitable fallout that leads to him and Rincewind fleeing the city. Sadly, after they leave the city, the details become rather sketchy, their absence only half excused by Terry Pratchett's frequent rambling asides where he explores a magical or theoretical concept with wry humour. In fact, at one point, for no reason, the story just skips forward to show a bedraggled and haggard pair of adventurers arrive at the final destination complaining about the exciting/thrilling journey that the reader's been kept largely oblivious of. This is all a pastiche on a genre that has moved on significantly over the decades since Mr. Pratchett published the original book. The hard-worn stereotypes he riffed on here have been replaced, possibly several times over, by brand new stereotypes. That is not to say there isn't much to love in The Colour of Magic, but the book makes an impenetrable read. Each individual segment works on its own, but they all feel isolated. Aside from the presence of Rincewind and Twoflower, who moves through the story with the grace of a brick passing through a slab of butter, there is little through line. Characters appear and vanish with little consequence, most appearing well written, and with appealing characteristics that prevent them from being one-note bit parts, but few then have the space to actually leave a lasting impression. What does leave an impression is the world itself. The unending, overwhelming sense of chaos that permeates this book, it doesn't let up to the end. The concept is great, but the execution in The Colour of Magic itself, maybe less so. It's not badly written by any means, far from it, and it's largely comical, but the written text is perhaps the weakest format of the story, particularly as it's only half an adventure, ending a particularly brutal cliffhanger and then a duff joke that will only get picked up on properly in the sequel book, The Light Fantastic. Perhaps this is why I was drawn into the graphic novel so deeply. Fragmented tales work in the comic format. It's how the medium is often designed to function. With each reimagining of The Colour of Magic, the content would be refined, the links that pull the story together tightened, and I am so glad that most of these reworkings occurred during the author's lifetime. But of course, none of that would have been possible without the solid original text to build it all from. But then, 3 years later, a jump from 1983 to 1986, the second book of the Discworld series would solve all of these problems. Make no mistake, whilst it's not as famous, The Light Fantastic is excellent justification. The Discworld is a place that follows archetypal fantasy, but does so through the lens of cynicism and wit. Its scope comes through a little clearer in the second attempt than in the predecessor, The Colour of Magic. Rather than riffing on high fantasy books with warrior maidens, gambling gods and nameless horrors, it offers a cottage made of sweets, an aged Conan the Barbarian, and a political struggle within the halls of wizardry as the devilish Triamon plots his way to the top. The set pieces, because like its predecessor, the plot is little more than loose movement from one to the next, are much shorter and snappier, resulting in much better flow. Perhaps the most significant improvement in this book is that it has more than two real protagonists. Though Terry Pratchett has a great gift for imbibing a hook into every character he writes, pushing one quirk or humanising detail to give them life, most serve only to advance either the plot or a joke. In the first half of this tale, only a few characters beside Rincewind and Twoflower had the room for real depth, as they came and went so quickly, but The Light Fantastic shows the reward of sticking with a good character to let them develop. Triamon is an excellent villain, a man whose selfishness threatens to destroy the world, and by putting this academic superstar against the dropout Rincewind, we finally get some evolution in the main hero in return. Although he's fun at first, Rincewind is not an ideal protagonist. He's a reactive presence, someone who responds in an interesting manner to any situation he finds himself in, but he does little to drive the story forwards. Pratchett was quoted as saying he created a character primarily to give him a vehicle to meet other, more interesting people, which he certainly manages. And whilst his character doesn't exactly develop here, it does go through some important experiences that mesh well with the theme of the book. And at the end, the underlying plot, that despite initial appearances does actually exist and was just biding its time, it hangs together on a few clever revelations that subtly reward the big questions posed from the first book without explicitly answering them. There are so many fantasy tropes and references stuffed into these books, it feels as though Terry Pratchett was in a rush to get through them all and get them out of the way as quick as possible. The first characters you meet, even before Rincewind and Twoflower, are pastiches on Farfred and the Grey Mouser, progenitors of the sword and sorcery genre that date all the way back to the 1930s. The homage takes these fun but essentially very silly concepts and gives us two takes on the characters who are very down to earth and human. It then follows with a genre mashup of H.P. Lovecraft horror with Dungeons and Dragons roleplay, and then what seems to be a PG-13 take on Anne McCaffrey's Dragon Riders series. None of these would be as blatant or well considered though as the standout appearance of Conan the Barbarian. Originating in pulp magazines, the original Conan the Barbarian, also from the 1930s, has starred in books, comics, television programs, movies, video games, and everything you can imagine. And in pretty much every one of these depictions, he's a strapping, chivalrous, muscle-bound young man with peak physical fitness. There are depictions of him aging, which typically involve him taking on a commanding presence, becoming a strong war leader, leading a charge of a cast of armies seeking political dominance. However, Pratchett's keen eye saw something in the character that would work even if you aged him up another half a century onwards after that. Youth and virility itself are not enough, and there are more interesting stories to be told about heroes who have lived on past the legend built up around them. Rincewind himself would go on to star in only a few more of the Discworld books, as Terry Pratchett found it difficult to centre a story about a character with no inner monologue. Twoflower would only be seen once or twice again, as he really was a joke which had worn itself out by the end of these two stories. However, the world, the city, the concept of Ankh-Morpork would endure, and concepts originated here would dominate the Discworld for years to come. The Patrician, the University, Death, the Great Turtle would set the scene of so many great adventures. However, some of the more fantastical elements would be quietly excised away. Pratchett seemed to realise that quality rather than quantity mattered when doing parody. Better to fully examine one great concept than carry out a rush safari, running through all of your great ideas, giving them each a moment to nod and wave before they're left in the dust. The series would refocus, re-engage and prosper for years to come, building a voracious audience desperate to consume over 80 million books that were translated into 37 separate languages. Future creations such as Granny Webberax, Sam Vimes, Death, Moist von Lipwig, Tiffany Aching, whilst poor Rincewind would lie almost forgotten. A mascot the series seemed almost ashamed of. If we can draw any comfort from his mistreatment, it's that he probably enjoys it that way. If the Discworld had begun and ended with 2 books, it would have been extremely diverting aside but little more. There are great ideas here, but until the second book, little patience to fashion them into a cohesive whole. It's deliberately written in an anarchic style, rebelling against the genre, taking pot shots at its source material, rather than focusing on its own ideas. And its own ideas are brilliant, but they only come through at the end, almost as a capstone of the journey. This is witty and often fun, but the balance is fundamentally flawed. However, the blueprints for something bigger are there, and I do recommend this, both as a historical record for anyone curious of how it all began, and anyone who just wants to know about the sex of the turtle.